Hi friends, let me tell you a tale wrapped in mist and murmurs, passed from candlelit chamber to frost-covered field, a tale not of kings and glory, but of shadow, silence, and survival. Our story begins in the year 536 Anno Domini, when the skies dimmed and the earth turned cold, not for days or weeks, but for long, weary months. It is a time often forgotten, but if you lean in close, you may still hear it breathing in the bones of old books and the soot-streaked stone of ancient halls. Close your eyes now and picture a morning unlike any you've ever known. The cock crows, the church bell tolls. But there is no dawn. The sky is the colour of tarnished silver, and a strange, soft dust settles over the village like ghostly snow. The warmth of the sun, once so faithful, has fled, leaving behind a chill that creeps through every crack in the thatch and stone. The chronicles say it began without warning. One morning, the sun rose behind a pale veil, so dim that people could stare directly at it, unblinking. No one knew why. Was it a punishment from heaven? A sign of the end times? The priests whispered of wrath and judgment, while the old women stirred ash into their tea and muttered about mountains of fire. In our tale, we will follow several voices, peasants and monks, shepherds and scribes, as they try to make sense of a world turned strange. You will not hear the thunder of dragons or the laughter of court jesters. This is not a tale for feasts and fanfare. No, this is a tale for firelight and stillness. A story to keep you company as sleep gently folds around you. In the highlands of what is now Ireland, the historian Gildas noticed the sun's failing light and wrote with trembling pen. Across the waters, Procopius in Constantinople described a year without sunlight. The crops failed, the winds turned cruel. People looked at the sky, but the sky looked away. But let us slow the clock and step backward. Before the world grew dim, there were signs, if one knew where to look. Tremors in the earth, birds flying in strange patterns, a faint bitter taste to the rain. In the east, the heavens bloomed red as if the sun were bleeding behind the clouds. And then the silence came. Our first story begins in the Alps with a boy named Elias, the son of a beekeeper. Elias lived in a stone cottage tucked between two ancient pines, where the mountains met the sky. His days were filled with the hum of bees, the scent of honeycomb, and the songs his mother sang while stirring nettle soup over the hearth. But that spring, the bees did not wake. The flowers remained curled in their buds, and a strange grey haze clung to the meadows. His father grew quiet, his eyes fixed on the mountains. "It is too still," he said one morning, his breath fogging, the air though it was late April. "Something sleeps in the earth, something old." The bees began to die, not from cold, but from confusion. They flew in circles, lost, unable to find the sun. And with the bees gone, the blossoms failed. Without blossoms, there could be no fruit. Without fruit, there could be no life. In the nearby monastery, the abbot wrote by candlelight. "This year, the Lord has darkened the light of the world. The air bites. The fields do not yield. I fear we are unworthy." Yet it was not just in the Alps. From the fjords of the north to the sands of Arabia, people felt it. The thinning warmth, the relentless fog, the long twilight hours. And so began the volcanic winter. Though no one then knew its name, the cause now slumbers in the pages of modern science. A great eruption, perhaps in Iceland or the far reaches of Asia, casting ash high into the stratosphere. Like a cloak over the earth, it blocked the sun's warmth, tipping the world into famine and fear. But for those living then, it was simply a mystery, an unwelcome dream from which there was no waking. Elias's family burned their last logs in June. Snow fell that midsummer's eve, and they slept beneath every woolen scrap they owned. His mother's songs grew quieter. His father no longer spoke to the trees. Each day, Elias fed the hens and counted the eggs, fewer and fewer, until there were none. And yet, in that endless dusk, Elias noticed something strange. At night, the stars seemed closer, clearer. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like spilled flour, and he began to whisper stories to the stars, hoping they would carry his words to the sun, wherever it had gone. Little did he know, across the continent, other voices whispered too. And so, dear listener, as the wind rises outside your own window, let us rest here in the quiet, where history meets hush. This is only the beginning. The year 536 will unfold before us, one shadowed, step at a time. Until then, draw your blanket close and dream softly. The night is long, but our story has only just begun. Long before parchment ever bore the name of 536, the desert winds were already restless. In the land that once cradled the empires of the East, where the incense roads wound like silver serpents across the scorched earth, a seer named Nura lived among the Bedouin. Her tent, woven of goat hair and shadow, stood alone near the whispering dunes of the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter. Few dared live so deep in the desert's heart, where the stars burned brightest and the earth cracked. Like old parchment, Nura did not seek out visions. They came to her unbidden, like smoke curling under the flap of her tent. For years, she had spoken of rains that never arrived, of herds that wandered astray, of wells that ran dry, and her people listened, though often with unease. But one twilight, the wind changed. She stood outside her tent, facing west, where the sun was supposed to set. But instead of a golden blaze, there was only a sickly red smear, like dried blood rubbed across the sky. The air carried a bitter scent, not of spices or heat, but of cold stones and distant fire. And then she fell, her legs buckling beneath her, as a terrible vision claimed her sight. She saw the sun as a black coin hanging over a withered world. Fields turned grey, rivers slowed, bones pressed through the skin of children's faces, and above it all, the sky wept ash like sorrow without end. When she awoke, her eyes brimmed with tears, though she did not know why. Her tribe gathered quietly, their faces etched with the wisdom of those who listen to silence more than speech. "What did you see?" the elder asked, his voice like old rope dragged through sand. Nura replied, her voice soft, as if afraid to speak the truth aloud. "The sky has been wounded, and the earth will not heal quickly." They began to notice it in their trade. Fewer caravans passing through, fewer merchants with bright silks and frankincense. The once rich ports of Aden and Oman reported strange tides, ships adrift, the scent of rot in their cargoes. Salt fish turned sour within hours, dried dates spoiled without reason, and still the sun stayed veiled. Far to the north, in the kingdom of Aksum, Ethiopian priests observed that even their sacred groves began to wither. The lions grew lean. The monks carved prayers into the walls of their stone churches, begging divine mercy. One inscription read, "The sky grieves, so must we." Even the Roman trade roads, the arteries that pumped silk, pepper, and pearls through the empires, began to falter. From Constantinople to Petra, from Ctesiphon to Damascus, the merchants' ledgers showed strange losses. Cloths arrived damp, spices grew mold, camels collapsed before reaching their next well. Some believed it was the wrath of forgotten gods. Others whispered of dragons battling in the heavens. But Nura knew. It was neither wrath nor beast. It was something older, something patient. She began marking the nights on the walls of her tent, not with ink, but with small scratches made by bone. And each night, she looked at the sky and prayed that the light would return, but it did not. Then, one morning, a stranger came from the west, riding a dust-covered mule and speaking broken Arabic. He claimed to be a scholar from Antioch, lost and wandering. His eyes were red with sleep, his skin burned and flaking. He spoke of clouds that rained ash, of snow in summer, and of people dying in the streets. He had journeyed across Anatolia, through the Levant, seeking something, answers perhaps, or sanctuary. But wherever he went, the skies offered none. When Noura met him, she offered him water and dates. He accepted gratefully, though the dates had begun to turn soft and dark. They sat in the shade of her tent, the air thick with heat and silence. "You have seen it too," he said. She nodded. "The sun is hiding." "No," he whispered. "The sun is dying." That night, Noura dreamed of a tree with black leaves, standing in the middle of a frozen oasis. Its roots wrapped around bones, its branches held birds too still to fly, and, above it all, the sky wept silver tears. She did not sleep again for many nights. In her next gathering, she told her people to gather stores of dates, millet, and salt. She warned them of a long, dark season, not of night, but of silence, hunger, and confusion. "Do not trust the winds," she said. "They carry lies." Elsewhere, word of Noura's prophecy began to spread, carried by traders and monks alike. In dusty scrolls kept in Syriac monasteries, fragments of her visions were recorded. "In the days of Ash," one line reads, "a woman of the sands saw the breath of the earth grow thin. As caravans failed and wells dried, those who had dismissed her now wondered. And as the volcanic veil wrapped tighter around the world, she became not just a seer, but a symbol, a flickering candle in the gathering dark. And so we leave Noura staring westward again, toward a horizon that has forgotten how to glow. Around her, the desert listens. Above her, the stars hold their breath. Next, we will cross into the frozen forests of northern Germania, where a tribe of woodcutters tries to understand why spring never came. Focus. Set in the dense forests of Germania, this part explores how the volcanic winter affected northern European tribes. We follow a family of woodcutters as they try to endure the spring that never arrived, discovering how nature itself began to unravel. In the old forests of the north, where pines sigh like monks in prayer and moss covers the bones of fallen giants, the people have long known the rhythm of the seasons. Snow in winter, blossoms in spring, green in summer, and fire-coloured leaves in fall. These cycles are the very breath of the land. But in the year 536, the forest forgot how to breathe. Our tale now follows a man named Halric, a woodcutter by blood and bone, whose family had lived for generations in the shadow of the Thuringian hills. His cabin stood where three paths met, lined with stacked timber and the smell of pine sap. Halric had a wife, Linda, and a small daughter named Fina, whose laugh once echoed brighter than the morning thrush. That winter had been cruel, but not unfamiliar. They had chopped wood, salted meat, and fed the fire until spring's first signs, a swelling bud, a robin's song, would call them back to ease. But this year, the robins never came. April arrived, and the snow did not melt. The rivers still carried ice like broken glass, and the sky hung low, the colour of old wool. Halric noticed that his axe no longer bit the wood clean. Sap ran sluggish, dull. The trees seemed reluctant to fall. One morning, Fina brought a flower to the hearth, an early bloom she'd found near a stream. It was already wilted in her hand. "It's too soon," Linda said softly, taking it from her daughter. It bloomed because it was confused. Halric stood by the window, staring at the woods. Everything is confused. The frost had crept into April like a thief. Their neighbours spoke of failed snares, of deer too thin to hunt, of ponds without fish. The birds had gone somewhere, but no one knew where. Even the wolves had grown silent. In the village nearby, the healer, an old woman named Gertra, lit fires day and night. She boiled bark into bitter tea, muttering that the trees were angry or mourning. "It is not sickness," she told Halric when he came for a poultice. "It is sorrow. The land is grieving." The people began to fall ill. not with plague, but with hunger, and with a quiet that settled over their bones. Children stopped growing. Men wandered off into the woods and forgot to return. The forest, once a source of life, had become a mirror to their despair. Halric tried to keep working. He chopped until his hands blistered, until his shoulders ached. Each log he split was a prayer, each tree a sacrifice, but the wood burned too fast, as if the cold devoured it more hungrily than before. One night, Fina asked why the stars had grown brighter. "I don't know," Halric said. Linda, brushing her daughter's hair, whispered, "Perhaps the sky is trying to guide us." But it felt more like a warning. In the forest, Halric found strange signs. Mushrooms blooming in patterns he didn't recognize, birds' nests with no eggs, and once a deer with fur so white it looked carved from snow. It did not flee when he approached. It simply stared at him, and he could see his breath in the air, though it was nearly May. Then the frost came inside. One morning, Halric awoke to find a thin layer of ice across the floorboards, like glass, grown from the night. The fire had gone out. Linda lay curled, her hands stiff. Fina, too, had grown quieter in her sleep. That day, Halric carried a heavy log from the forest, one thicker than usual, taken from an ancient pine. He split it, wept as he did, and burned it slowly, feeding the flames like they were the last living thing in the world. He remembered stories his grandfather told, of gods who slept beneath mountains, who breathed smoke and fire when roused. "When the sky is wrong," the old man once said, "something below has stirred." Halric began carving symbols into the wood near the hearth. Not runes of war or prayer, but circles and spirals, shapes he'd seen once on old stones buried deep in the forest. It gave him comfort, though he did not know why. The days stretched, dim and grey. Time became a trick of the shadows. The village bell rang only once a week when someone died, and always the frost returned each night, no matter how hard the sun tried to rise. Fina asked, "Will summer come, Papa?" Halric could not lie. He crouched beside her and said, "It may be late this year." "Like the deer," she whispered. "The white one." He nodded. "Yes, just like the deer." In the stillness of the forest, even the trees seemed to wait. But one day, as Halric wandered deep into the woods, he found something that made his heart stutter. A single blue flower blooming through a crack in the frost-covered earth. It quivered in the wind, fragile and small, but stubborn in its bloom. He brought it home, not to burn, but to show Fina. She smiled, for the first time in many days, and placed it beside the hearth in a little clay cup filled with melted snow. They did not know whether it meant hope or farewell, only that it had dared to grow. And so, in the frozen stillness of Germania's woods, where spring had lost its way, a single bloom whispered of resistance. Next, we will journey eastward, into the vast lands of the Eastern Roman Empire, where politics, plague, and prophecy collide in a crumbling Constantinople. In the gleaming city of Constantinople, where golden domes caught the morning sun like mirrors to heaven, at least they once had, the air now hung thick with ash and anticipation. By the year 536, the city, jewel of the Eastern Roman Empire, stood uneasy beneath skies that had forgotten how to shine. Our witness in this chapter is Theodorus, a palace scribe, tasked not with shaping policy or law, but with chronicling time itself. Every day, he dipped his reed pen into ink thick with iron and soot, writing the names of the dead, the weight of grain shipments, and the number of beggars counted beneath the southern arch of the Hagia Sophia. He was not a priest nor a soldier, yet in his quiet observance, he saw more than most. That spring, Theodorus noticed something strange in the imperial archive. The ink was darker. The candles, despite their number, cast weak light, and the parchment, which had always crackled like crisp leaves, now felt damp. though there had been no rain. The city itself had grown somber. Once, the marketplace at the Augustaian Square rang with the clash of coin and the cries of olive sellers. But now, merchants wrapped their wares in damp cloths, complaining of rot. Fish spoiled before reaching the stalls, bread hardened too fast, and still, above the city, the sun remained a pale ghost. At first, Emperor Justinian assumed it was a passing matter. He ordered incense burned from Egypt and Ethiopia, believing the heavy scent might clear the foul humours. He summoned astronomers who stared at the clouded heavens and muttered of portents. Procopius, the emperor's favoured historian, wrote in his private journal, never meant for the public eye, of the year without light, when the sun shone feebly, like the moon, for an entire year. Theodorus read this entry once, by accident, and never forgot it. The priests, meanwhile, filled the city with hymns of penance. Processions marched barefoot through the streets, chanting for the mercy of Christ. They carried icons turned backward, and in one haunting parade, they covered every mosaic of the Virgin with veils of ash-dyed linen. The people, many of them already gaunt from the lingering effects of the Justinianic plague that had surged years before, now faced new fears. Crops brought in from Anatolia arrived stunted. Ships from Alexandria were late, and when they did come, they bore bad news of failing harvests and wild rumours, fire raining in the west, snow falling in Arabia, and a growing darkness across all lands. In the baths of Zeuxippus, once a place of leisure and gossip, citizens gathered not to bathe, but to exchange theories. Some claimed the darkness was caused by a comet. Others believed it was a curtain of ash sent by God to remind men of their sin. A few, those who remembered the old gods, whispered of Typhon stirring once more from beneath the mountains of smoke. Theodorus, for his part, did not claim to know the cause, but he watched the pigeons nesting in the columns. He saw them cease their morning flights. He saw the harbour gulls vanish altogether. He heard no songbirds on his walk to the scriptorium. One afternoon, a scholar named Manas visited the imperial library. He had come from Antioch, bearing with him scrolls damaged by soot and a tale of cities clouded in darkness. It is not a punishment, Manas told Theodorus. It is a wound. The sky has been pierced, and the blood is ash. Theodorus recorded that phrase in the margin of a ledger, where no one else would see it. By summer, the palace had grown cold, even beneath its gilded ceilings. Fires were lit in chambers that had never needed them. Theodorus began wearing gloves, while writing, not out of vanity, but because the ink would freeze if left too long exposed. The mosaics of Christ, set high in the apse of the great church, seemed to shimmer less with glory and more with judgment. Then came the refugees, from the western provinces, from the Balkans, from the failing farms of Thrace. They arrived in droves, hollow-eyed, shoeless, with infants wrapped in cloth so thin they may as well have been dreams. Theodorus stood on the marble steps of the palace gate and counted. Hundreds, then thousands, then too many to count. The emperor ordered grain reserves opened, but there was too little. Fistfights broke out over bowls of lentils. Bread riots erupted in the forum. Theodorus witnessed one such fight from the safety of a clerestory window. Two women clutching a crust as if it were a crown, and always the sky remained silent. One night, Theodorus climbed the steps of the lighthouse of Alexandria, newly rebuilt after a tremor had cracked it the previous year. He stared out over the sea, which was so still it looked like slate. The stars were piercing above, but they offered no warmth, only cold light, as if they, too, had turned their backs on the earth. He whispered into the wind, "How do you write the end of light?" There was no answer, only the creaking of ships in harbour and the distant toll of the midnight bell. He returned to his chamber and wrote one line in his private journal. "The city does not weep because the sky has stolen all our tears." And so Constantinople, heart of empire, shivers beneath its marble skin. We will soon move again, next to the far reaches of Britannia, where the Druids, long silent, sense an old magic stirring in the twilight of the world. In the hollow lands of Western Britannia, where chalk paths wind like runes through the green and the grey, there stands a place older than empires, Avebury. The circle of stones there is not so perfect as Stonehenge, nor so grand, but it breathes with a quieter magic. Some say the stones hum at night, others claim they shift when no one is watching. Few dwell near them now, save sheep and wind and the occasional traveller. But one woman, Merwin, called that place home. Merwin was neither young nor ancient. Her hair was silvering, her back strong from years of gathering herbs, and her heart bruised but beating. She had lost her husband to a winter fever, and her son to Roman swords long ago. Since then, she had lived alone in a cottage built from crumbled dry stone and thatch, just beyond the eastern arch of the stones. She was known among the locals as a wise woman, a healer, and perhaps something more. It was said that she walked barefoot in snow and knew when the sheep would birth by scent alone. Some believed she spoke with birds. Children whispered that she could hear the stones themselves. In truth, Merwin had no magic, only memory, and in 536, memory became a kind of prophecy. It began with the crows. They flew in strange patterns, never settling, as if pursued by something unseen. Then came the stillness, the same stillness that Halric in Germania had noticed, that Nura in the desert had feared. The animals grew uneasy, the moss began to fade, and then the sky dimmed. The people of the nearby village, worn already by bad harvests and whispered raids from across the sea, came to Merwin for answers. They brought her bread, salted fish, and questions too old for any priest. Why won't the sun rise? Is this the end of days? Have we angered the gods or forgotten them? Merwin, seated beside her hearth with a fox pelt across her knees, listened, and then she stood, wrapped herself in her dead husband's woolen cloak, and walked to the stones. There, in the centre of the ring, she laid her hand upon the tallest stone, known to some as the Guardian. It was slick with dew, colder than stone should be, and silent as ever. But Merwin whispered the old words, words not taught in church nor written on scrolls, words passed from mother to daughter when the world was still made of shadow and sound. That night, she dreamed of a stag with a crown of fire running through a field of ash. The next morning, she told the villagers, "The sun is caught in a net, not of rope, but of smoke and sorrow. It must burn through it slowly, or be lost." Whether they understood or not, they believed her. By late May, it was as cold as February. The hedgerows bore no berries. The streams froze at night. Even the sheep grew thin beneath their wool. Merwin taught the people how to render pine into tea, how to dry nettles, how to bake root cakes from what little remained in the earth. She gathered every dried herb from her rafters and rationed them with the care of a steward guarding a holy flame. But something else stirred too. One dawn, just before the ghost of light crept over the downs, Merwin found strange symbols etched into the snow near the stone circle. They were not her runes, not of the church, not of the Romans. The marks returned, night after night, careful spirals, 3-dot clusters, and the shape of a tree with no leaves. She said nothing to the villagers, but began leaving sprigs of yew and oak at the base of each stone as a gesture of respect, or perhaps fear. Soon, others came, silent pilgrims from farther villages, led not by road or star, but by stories. They knelt in the grass near the stones. They whispered prayers half remembered. They burned rosemary and sang in languages no longer taught. Merwin, watching from the edge of the circle, did not stop them. Something had awakened, not in the stones, but in the people. The church took notice. A travelling monk, Brother Leofric, came from Glastonbury with a staff of ash and a scroll of warnings. He spoke to the villagers with passion, calling the rituals near the stones pagan and dangerous. They offer no salvation, he cried, only illusion. But even he admitted, in quieter moments, that the darkness had unsettled his faith. Merwin met him by the hearth one night and served him tea steeped in elderflower. "What is an illusion, brother?" she asked gently, "when the sun itself has vanished?" He had no answer. One night, the villagers held a vigil, not at church, but in the circle. They lit lanterns of oil and tallow, sang songs that blended, Latin with older melodies, and stood in silence beneath the ash-dark sky. And for a moment, as Merwin would later write in her journal of bark and beeswax, the stones felt warm beneath our feet. The sun did not rise the next morning, but nor did it disappear entirely. That day, a faint golden glow touched the edge of the fields, like the memory of fire through fog. It lasted only moments, but it was enough to fill a bowl with hope. Thus ends our quiet passage through Avebury, where forgotten faiths and enduring hearts met beneath the breathless sky. Now let us journey onward, to the icy reaches of Scandinavia, where longboats sit idle and ravens circle a world without day. North of the known kingdoms, where the sea bit deeper and the sky hung lower, the longhouses of the Norsemen huddled like beasts before the storm. It was in one of these, at the edge of a frozen fjord named Solheim, that Eirik the Skald kept a fire that burned not only for warmth, but for story. He was not a warrior, though he had once sailed west with raiders, his axe now gathered dust by the hearth. His weapon was the voice, and his armour, memory. In the great hall of Jorlingar, Eirik would stand upon the whalebone step and sing of ancient heroes, of gods who shaped the earth, and of women who could speak with ravens. But in the year 536, his voice grew quiet. The sun had abandoned them. It did not rise properly, even in summer, and when it did, it hovered like a dying coal over the edge of the world. The sea froze in places where it never had. The cod ran thin. The eiders did not return. The elders murmured of Ragnarök, not as a future to come, but a present unfolding. Eirik sat by the central fire, carving runes into driftwood. One reed, Daga er Dauda, the day is dead. The young ones gathered close each night, wide-eyed, cold, and hungry for tales that made the world feel less fragile. But Eirik found it harder to tell the old stories. What use was a tale of Thor's mighty hammer when thunder no longer rolled across the sky? One boy asked him, "Why do the gods not answer?" Eirik looked to the rafters, where smoke curled like tired spirits. "Perhaps they sleep," he said. "Why? They are old, and the world is heavy." But the truth haunted him. Perhaps it was not the gods who slept, but the faith in them that had waned. By mid-year, they had slaughtered every spare goat. The winter stores, usually well managed and bolstered by salted herring, were exhausted. The fjord had not thawed, and no ship had sailed in months. Even the great longboat Varga, once pride of the clan, sat frozen to its mooring post, its carved prow bowed with frost. The chieftain, Hrold Skullsplitter, began organizing strange rites. Offerings of mead and blood at the stone altar near the waterfall, sheep throats slit and runes cast into the foam, but no sign came, no raven, no wind. Eirik was asked to write new verses, to inspire courage. He tried. Twilight bites deeper than sword or sin, yet still we light the flame within. Though gods grow silent, men still sing. The fire outlasts the fading ring. He scratched the lines onto birch bark and left them by the door. No one read them aloud. The children fell sick first, quiet coughs that deepened into silence. The eldest among them stopped rising in the morning. They stayed by the fire, wrapped in wolf pelts, their eyes dull and distant, as if looking for something that no longer existed. Then came the wolves. Driven by hunger, they emerged from the forests, lean and ragged, no longer howling, but creeping silently into the edges of the village. One night, they tore apart the last of the sheep. Another, they clawed at the walls of the granary. Hrold declared war upon them, and the few remaining warriors set traps and waited in the snow. But the wolves were clever, and perhaps more desperate than men. Eric wrote a lament for the sheep. Once you gave wool, now you give bone, in the cold where gods do not roam. Blessed be the bleating ghost, gone to where the frost bites most. No one asked him to sing it, but something strange began to happen in the twilight days. Stories changed. No longer did they feature gods of thunder and mischief, but smaller tales, of hearths that stayed warm against all odds, of children who dreamed of green fields, of a fish that leapt through frozen water just once, and then was gone. One night, Eric stood beneath the northern lights, though they were dimmer than he remembered, and felt something stir in his chest. Not fire exactly, not quite hope, but something like remembering. He took the old axe from above the hearth, not to hunt, but to carve. He hewed a stone at the edge of the fjord, where the sea once lapped. Into it, he carved a single line of runes. Let those who come know. We waited for the sun. In the morning, he placed a stone bowl before it, filled with pine needles and dry lichen, the only offerings left. The youngest child, still healthy, a girl named Bryndis, asked if the sun would return. Eric knelt before her, placed his weathered hand on her head and said, "It has never truly left. It is only walking slowly." So ends our time in the frost-bound north, where silence speaks louder than sword, and memory holds firmer than steel. Next, we turn toward the east once more, to the steppes of Central Asia, where horsemen pause mid-ride and watch a sky they no longer recognize. The Silk Road had never been silent. For centuries, it had pulsed like a living vein across the land, threading together empires, cultures, and whispers. From the eastern gates of Chang'an to the proud walls of Antioch, it carried not just silk and spices, but ideas, songs, dreams, and sometimes omens. But in the year 536, the Silk Road grew quiet. Temur was a caravan guide, born to the Kyrgyz herders of the Tian Shan foothills. He had learned to ride before he could walk, to navigate stars before he knew the names of cities. His father had called him Windborn, for he was faster than any cousin and more curious than any goat. At 22, he led his first major crossing, 6 camels, 3 traders, and a dozen bolts of silk, bound for Samarkand. But as they crossed the Taklamakan desert, the sun vanished. It began as a haze, common enough in dusty lands, but then it thickened, turned grey, and swallowed sound. The camels grew restless. The traders grew superstitious. One began praying to a wooden idol. Another rubbed coins together and muttered curses in Sogdian. Temur tried to press forward. But the heat was wrong. The days did not bake. They lingered, tepid and dim, as if the sky had turned its face away. By the time they reached Dunhuang, half their water had spoiled, and the dried fruit had turned to rot. The monks at the Mogao caves, once so eager to offer blessings to caravans, now kept their doors closed. A scroll hung by the gate read, "Heaven mourns, be silent." Temur took the words to heart. He stopped singing to his camels. He no longer told stories by firelight. Instead, he began noticing things. How the wind moved differently, how birds flew lower, how even the stars seemed to retreat behind some hidden veil. One evening, as they camped near a salt flat under a half-visible moon, an old merchant named Bahram shared a tale. He spoke of a mountain to the north that had bled fire years ago, of a black rain that fell for 7 days. "The earth remembers," he whispered, "and now it tells us to listen." Temur didn't believe in omens, but he knew how to read tracks in sand, and there were no animal tracks anymore. At the edge of the Pamir Mountains, they reached a caravanserai abandoned. Food stores had been ransacked. The well had frozen, though it was midsummer. and carved into the lintel above the gate was a phrase, crudely etched in Uyghur script, "The sky is broken." They debated turning back, but the path east was as treacherous as the one ahead. So they pushed onward, through ice-laced winds and nights so cold that the camel's breath froze mid-air. When they reached Samarkand, the gates were shut. No traders, no welcome, just guards in soot-covered armor, telling them, plague, famine, no entry. Bahram wept. He had family inside. Temur watched the sky and said nothing. They camped outside the city for 7 nights. On the 8th, a rider approached from the west. His horse was foam-covered. His face was wrapped in black silk. He carried no wares, only a message. Ctesiphon burns. Constantinople weeps. The road is no more. By the time they reached Bukhara, the silk had begun to mold in its wrappings. The cinnamon had turned sour. They sold what they could for sacks of millet and news. It was the same everywhere. Marketplaces were empty. Monks were silent. Even thieves had abandoned the trade routes, for there was little left to steal. Timur stood at the edge of the Oxus River and wondered, if the road dies, what becomes of those who travel it? He thought of his father's stories, of ghost caravans that wandered eternally beneath eclipsed moons, of sandstorms that whispered forgotten names. That night, he dreamed of a camel walking alone beneath a black sun. He awoke with frost on his eyebrows, despite it being the height of summer, and yet, not all was silence. In the town of Balkh, where an old Zoroastrian fire temple still stood, an elder invited Temur to sit by the eternal flame. It burned low, almost invisible, but it had not gone out. "You are not the first to see the sun die," the elder said, feeding a stick of sandalwood into the embers. "It has happened before, and it will happen again." Timur asked, "What do we do when the road is lost?" "Build memory," the elder replied, "so that when light returns, we remember what darkness taught us." Temur stayed 1 week in Balkh. He wrote down all he could recall: maps, customs, recipes, laughter, even quarrels. He buried a copy beneath the altar of the fire temple. The other he bound in camel hide and carried close to his chest. When he finally turned back east toward his homeland, he did not call it retreat. He called it a new path, a quieter one. For though the road was empty, the stars were still watching, and perhaps in time they would sing again. And thus ends our journey along the ash-veiled Silk Road. Next, we'll travel south to the temples of India, where astrologers gaze into silent heavens, and ascetics wait for a sun that does not rise. The Ganges had always sung. It sang through monsoon and drought, through war and festival. It carried ashes and prayers alike, winding its way from the high snows of the Himalayas to the wide, salt-washed mouths near the Bay of Bengal. It was said that the river was a goddess, and that her voice could soothe the hearts of kings and beggars alike. But in the year 536, the Ganges grew quiet. In a small temple nestled near the city of Varanasi, a boy named Arjuna rose each morning before dawn to sweep the stone steps leading down to the river. He was an apprentice to the temple Brahmins, too young to chant from the Vedas, but old enough to feel when something in the world had shifted. And that year, he noticed it first in the water. The river ran sluggish, its flow strangely dull. The morning mist, once golden and scented with marigold, now clung grey and sour, like smoke that had forgotten its fire. The priests grew restless. The bells they rang at sunrise sounded hollow. Then came the silence. No bird song at dawn, no splash of fish, no distant flute from the ghats. The sky, always a canvas of blush and saffron, now hovered in shades of pewter. The sun, when it deigned to appear, did so with the dimness of a dying coal. The astrologer Vasudeva, oldest of the temple sages, climbed to the roof with his brass astrolabe and peered into the heavens for answers. He stayed there for 3 days, eating nothing but rainwater and staring upward through the ash-laced haze. When he descended, he said only this: "The wheel has slipped its groove." The priests debated its meaning. Was it a curse, an age ending, the punishment of Indra or Shiva? But Vasudeva offered no more words. He sat beneath the peepal tree and listened for voices that would not come. Arjuna, too, felt the shift. He saw it in the way offerings wilted before noon, in the monkeys who now scavenged in silence, in the candles that refused to stay lit, as though the air itself had forgotten how to hold flame. But most of all, he saw it in the pilgrims. They arrived by the dozens, then the hundreds. Faces drawn, eyes searching. They came not to bathe or to seek blessing, but to understand. Some wept openly. Others sat for hours in prayer, unmoving, unblinking. A few whispered of rivers drying in their villages, of snow falling where rice should grow, of nights too long, and stars that refused to dance. One pilgrim, a widow named Manorama, told Arjuna, "The world has entered a hush. Even my grief feels heavier." In time, the priest declared a great yajna, a fire ritual of cleansing and renewal. Wood was gathered, oil was poured, chants rose into the heavy air. But when the flame was lit, it sputtered. Smoke curled downward instead of rising, and the wind, which should have carried the mantras to the heavens, remained still. Vasudeva watched unmoving. Arjuna approached him later and asked, "Is the world ending?" The old man shook his head slowly. Not ending, folding inward, like a breath held too long. Despite the gloom, life pressed on. Arjuna continued his chores. He swept the ghats. He fed the sacred cow. He tended to the sandalwood incense, though it barely gave off scent. But he began keeping a journal, scratched with a charcoal stub onto palm leaves. In it, he recorded the changes. Day 27, no sunrise, only ash light. Day 30, monsoon failed to arrive. Clouds only hang, never cry. Day 41, river tastes bitter near shore. Day 48, a yogi walked into the water and did not surface. No ripples. On the 50th day of the hush, the head priest, Raghunatha, gathered the remaining sages and declared, "A fast. Until the sun speaks again," he said, "we shall eat nothing grown, nothing warm." Many followed. Arjuna tried to, but hunger gnawed too fiercely. He chewed on dried mango rind and begged forgiveness. Yet, amidst the sorrow, a strange peace settled. The people became quieter, more attentive. Without the guidance of sun or star, they turned inward. The blind woman, who had once begged at the temple gate, began humming a melody none could name. The children, thin but patient, began stacking stones in gentle towers along the riverbank. Arjuna, standing one evening beside the dark water, whispered into the breeze, "Where have you gone, Surya?" calling the sun by its ancient name. He did not expect an answer. But that night, in his dreams, he stood on a river made of light. Above him, a sky of flame and gold, and 1,000 voices humming a single note. When he awoke, tears clung to his cheeks. He told Vasudeva of the dream. The old man smiled faintly. "Then it has begun. The memory, that is how the world returns." Arjuna continued his journal, now not just recording decay, but moments of resilience. Day 60, a lotus bloomed in the temple pond, small but clear. Day 63, a child laughed, truly laughed. Day 67, light shimmered on the water for 10 full breaths, and when, on the 70th day, the sky broke slightly open at dawn and a pale shaft of warmth touched the eastern steps, he knelt and wept. So the river sang again, softly, and in the hush of a veiled world, the people of the Ganges remembered how to wait. Now we journey westward, toward the high deserts of Persia, where Zoroastrian firekeepers wrestle with the meaning of flame in a time when the sky no longer listens. In the heart of the Iranian plateau, where desert winds carry the secrets of centuries, and the mountains wear snow like sorrow, there lies a city known for its resilience, Yazd. Here, amid clay towers and domes painted in Earth's own tones, the old fire of Zoroaster still burns, or it did, until the sky began to darken. Asha, daughter of Vahram the firekeeper, had lived her whole life within the Atashkade, the fire temple, its scent of sandalwood and reverence embedded into every fold of her clothes, every line of her palms. From the age of 5, she had watched her father tend the sacred flame, a fire said to have burned continuously for over 1,000 years. It was not just heat or light. It was a symbol of divine truth, Asha, from which she bore her name. But in the year 536, the fire changed. At first it was subtle. The flames danced slower. The smoke curled more tightly. Then the wood itself began to resist burning. It crackled, not with the voice of spirit, but with the whisper of damp ash. Asha watched her father add more logs, more oils, even dried herbs. But the light grew weaker. And then one morning, a terrifying stillness. The fire refused to rise. Vahram fell to his knees before it, whispering prayers older than empires. He touched the cold ash with trembling fingers. "Have we failed?" he asked aloud, though no one answered. Asha took his hand and said only, "Not yet." That evening, they relit it, using the reserve flame from a copper bowl kept deep in. The temple's inner sanctum passed from one firekeeper to the next in secret. But even then, the flame seemed thin, unsure. Outside, the sky wept ash. The towers of Yazd turned grey. The sun, veiled as if in mourning, cast no shadows. The desert, usually a place of clear skies and sharp stars, now felt like the inside of a tomb. The community gathered more often at the temple, not to celebrate, but to plead. Farmers spoke of crops withering in clay pots. Shepherds told of stillborn lambs. Water, drawn from the kanats beneath the city, now tasted metallic and was colder than it had ever been in summer. The priests debated, was this Angra Mainyu, the spirit of destruction, finally unchained? Had the darkness broken through the sacred barrier between order and chaos? Asha kept to her task. She watched the flame hourly, fed it with what little fuel remained, and whispered the gathas under her breath. Even when her father fell ill with fever and could no longer rise from his mat, she tended the fire alone. One night, a dust storm swallowed the city whole. Winds screamed through the badgirs, the wind catchers of Yazd, and for hours it felt as if the world itself would be buried. When the storm passed, the flame had dimmed again, so low it barely glowed, but it had not died. Asha refused to leave the temple, even to sleep. She wove a braid of date palm fronds and fed it to the fire. She sliced her own long shawl and offered strips of it, singing, "Light is the path, fire is the breath. We do not falter." Then came the pilgrims. Word had spread across the region. The sky had darkened, but the flame of Yazd still lived. From Shiraz and Isfahan, from remote villages at the foot of the Zagros Mountains, they came, emaciated, exhausted, but carrying bundles of dry twigs, scrolls of prayer, and tales of vanished stars. One man had walked barefoot for 12 days, carrying nothing but a single fig wrapped in cloth. He laid it before the fire and said, "This is all that grew. I offer it back." An old woman recited a hymn to Anahita, goddess of water and wisdom, and when she finished, wept for a full hour. Asha did not speak. She simply added each offering to the flame, and in return, it flared. Just slightly. Her father, thin and frail, called her to his side one evening and said, "You carry what I no longer can, the fire and its memory." She nodded, tears cooling too quickly on her cheeks. Outside, the city grew quieter. People walked with softer steps. Clay jars were shared without words. The bazaars no longer shouted, only murmured. And within the temple, The flame, though faint, persisted. Then one morning, the impossible, a patch of sun. It pierced the clouds like a blade of amber, striking the dome above the fire temple. For one brief moment, it lit the room so fully that even the faded tiles of Faravahar on the walls gleamed like gold. Asher stood before the flame, bathed in warmth, not felt in months. The flame responded. It rose higher than it had since the darkness began. It crackled, not with fear, but with joy. The priest sang, the people gathered, and Asher whispered to the fire, "You are not alone." From that day forward, she inscribed a single sentence into the stone beneath the altar. "We are the keepers of what cannot be extinguished." So burns the flame of Yazd, a quiet defiance in a world grown dim. Next, we will sail to the shores of Italy, where Roman villas stand hollow and philosophers pace empty courtyards, awaiting light that may never return. By 536, Rome was no longer the Rome of empire. The Senate House had long been quiet. The aqueducts ran dry more often than not. Marble villas, once polished and prided, stood hollow-eyed among fields of thistle. Yet the names still lingered like incense in the air, faint, noble, and hard to forget. In the southern quarter of the old city, where ivy climbed the broken ribs of what had once been a triumphal arch, lived a man named Cassianus. He had once been a senator's son, educated, in Athens polished in rhetoric, fluent in both Latin and Greek. But when the empire fractured and the world grew lean, he retreated into study, into stillness. He inherited a modest villa with crumbling columns and a courtyard full of feral cats. There, he read, he wrote, he wandered among the olive trees, now more twig than branch. And in the year 536, the shadows came. Cassianus noticed it in his morning ritual. Each dawn, he would read by the sun's first light, seated beside a faded mosaic of Minerva. But one morning, the light never came. The sky remained iron grey. He lit a lamp, thinking it an odd fog. But the next day was the same, and the next, and the next. Soon, the lamp became his only dawn. Word trickled in from passing traders and friars. The sky was dim from Gaul to Carthage. Crops failed. Locusts fell dead from the air. Even the Pope had called for days of fasting, pleading with heaven to lift its veil. Cassianus was skeptical of gods, yet deeply devoted to truth. And the truth now pressed against his days like a cold stone wall. Time became unmoored. Shadows never left. The birds, so many once nested in his olive grove, vanished. The fountains went dry. Only the cats remained, curling in strange corners, watching him with moonlit eyes. He began writing again, not epistles or dialogues, but simple observations, scratched in careful Latin into a leather-bound codex. The sun has grown pale, like a dying philosopher who no longer debates. Time no longer lives in the clock of light, but in the slow ache of hunger. My olive trees bear nothing, neither fruit, nor shade, nor peace. His neighbours fared worse. The poor scraped bark for broth. The elderly shared bread crusts in silence. A beggar on the Via Appia claimed that the gods had all fled, taking light with them. One afternoon, a former soldier named Petronius came to his door. Once a legionary stationed in Dalmatia, he now limped with frostbite, his left hand wrapped in rags. He sought warmth, not from fire, but from memory. "I used to believe Rome would rise again," Petronius confessed by Cassianus's hearth. "But now even the sun bows its head." Cassianus offered him wine, sour but strong, and spoke gently. "Perhaps the sun has not bowed. Perhaps it merely rests." The soldier laughed. "We were taught that Rome endures all things. Fire, war, betrayal. But this is nothing. And still it breaks us." Cassianus said nothing. He only stared at the oil lamp flickering beside a statue of Mercury, whose face had long since crumbled. Days stretched into sameness. Smoke from distant fires curled lazily over the ruined forum. Wolves were seen nearer to the outskirts. Graves were dug shallow, and prayers grew shorter. Even the church bells no longer rang with force. And then, one day, a boy arrived. Barefoot, eyes wide, no older than 10. He held in his hand a stone, flat, smooth, carved with a crude symbol of the sun. "My sister told me the sun lives in stones now," he said, offering it to Cassianus. The philosopher took it solemnly. Later that evening, he placed the stone in the center of his study and stared at it for hours, not because it glowed, not because it held truth, but because it was offered in faith. That night, he wrote, "Perhaps Rome's last temple is not of stone, but of memory, and in memory we are not yet lost." He began teaching again. A handful of children, ragged and curious, gathered in his ruined courtyard. He spoke of Cicero, of Plato, of the rise and fall of men and empires. But he also spoke of the stars, of their silence. He spoke of waiting, of endurance, of truth not found in light, but in how we survive the absence of it. He recited an old passage from Virgil, "Phosan et haec olim meminissa juvabit." Perhaps someday we will find joy in remembering even this. By the time summer's end arrived, Cassianus's olive trees remained bare, but moss had begun to grow upon the columns, and one jasmine vine had sprouted unexpectedly along the arch. And one morning, though faint and weak, a shaft of light touched the floor of his study. He sat down before it, cross-legged, and whispered, "Welcome back, friend." And so, under the dim glow of a faltering sun, Rome breathes not with empire, but with memory, language, and fragile hope. Now, let us drift further westward, across the sea, to the edge of the known world, where monks in Irish cloisters illuminate manuscripts by candlelight, even as the skies above them forget how to shine. At the edge of the world, where the stone meets the foam and the sky hangs close like the breath of God, stood a monastery forgotten by time but remembered by the sea. It was built upon Enis Moor, a lonely island of rock and prayer, far off the western coast of Hibernia. The monastery was called Clúan na Néon, the meadow of birds, not because of flowers, but for the countless gulls and ravens that once wheeled above its wind-lashed towers. In the year 536, those birds began to vanish. Brother Finan was the youngest among them, a scribe and scholar with ink-stained fingers and the face of one who had looked too long at the horizon. He had come to the island to escape the noise of the mainland, but now there was no noise left to escape. The days, once shaped by bells and sunbeams, began to lose their edges. At matins, the sky remained black. At vespers, it was no darker. The sun had grown timid, pale, ghostly, like a candle seen through cloth. The abbot at first attributed it to an omen, perhaps a penance required of the faithful. "The Lord tests his servants," he said. "We are to endure, but endurance requires measure, and without light, time itself unraveled." Brother Finan's task was to illuminate Scripture, the Psalms, the Gospels, ancient commentaries brought from Gaul by barefoot pilgrims, yet the candles now melted too quickly, and their wax grew soft and sour. Ink bled across vellum, gold leaf turned dull before it touched the page. And still, he wrote. Each morning, he would rise and enter the scriptorium, where the walls were damp and the air held the scent of mildew and mould. He traced letters with care, though his hand began to shake, not from age, but from cold. Each word he felt was a rescue, a memory pulled from the edge of forgetting. By the third month of the dimming, the monks began to speak in whispers. They said the world was folding in, like a scroll rolled shut by invisible hands. They fasted longer, prayed louder, walked more slowly, as if treading through dreams. Brother Finan began keeping a second book, separate from Scripture, a chronicle of the world's silence. Day 41, no sun, no birdsong. Bread mold grows faster than the wheat. Day 46, a lamb born with no cry. buried beneath the Hill of Crosses. Day 53. A pilgrim arrived with empty hands, said he followed a whisper west. Each entry was both a testament and a question. At night, the brothers gathered in the chapel, its walls thick with chill. They lit what fire they could and recited psalms, their voices echoing strangely in the stone. The old abbot began to forget names. Another monk fell into a trance and muttered lines of prophecy from the book of Revelation. Yet even amid despair, small miracles persisted. A single rose bloomed in the herb garden despite the frost. A gull returned one morning, landing atop the bell tower and letting out a cry that brought tears to the eyes of even the sternest among them. Brother Finan saw a rainbow, faint, short and low, arching across the sea like a breath held in hope. Still, they endured. On the island's edge stood a beehive hut, ancient, older than the monastery itself. Brother Finan claimed it for his own retreat. Inside, he lit a single taper and began to write not in Latin, but in Gaelic, the tongue of his people, of the land, of song. He wrote a prayer. To the sun who hides, we have not forgotten you. We sing your warmth, even in chill. We remember your face, though we see it not. Return in your own hour, we shall be here. When he read it aloud to the others, none spoke. But that evening, each monk returned to his cell and began composing his own lines, not of fear nor prophecy, but of memory. Together, they created a new book, Liber Tenebrarum, the Book of the Darkness. It contained poems, drawings, herbal, recipes, weather notations, bird sketches, dreams, and fragments of overheard prayers. It became a vessel of living history, not just of the world, but of the human heart when light fails. One dawn, if dawn it could be called, a faint shimmer touched the sea. The grey broke slightly, revealing not the full sun, but a pale disk behind thinning cloud. It was enough. The bell rang. Brother Finan looked up from his work and saw, for the first time in weeks, the faintest glimmer of his own shadow on the floor. He stood, walked to the threshold, and lifted his face to the sky. The others joined him in silence, and the sea, ever ancient, sang. Thus, far from Rome, desert and palace, in a place forgotten by maps but remembered in spirit, the monks of the dimming, west held the light in their books and bones. Next, we cross east again, beyond the Great Wall, to where an emperor stares into a sky that gives no signs, and silence creeps into the celestial court. In the city of Jiangkang, where the Yangtze curved like a painted ribbon, and palace roofs shimmered like scales of dragons, the heavens had always spoken. They spoke through comets, eclipses, the color of clouds at sunrise. They whispered through turtle shells and stalks of yarrow. In the great marble observatory above the Hall of Auspicious Star Patterns, they spoke most clearly to Shunbao, a man whose entire life had been spent listening to the sky. By imperial decree, Shunbao rose before first light to observe the stars. He was not a fortune teller, but a keeper of cosmic harmony, one of the Tianwen Shi, the watchers of heaven's will. And never in his 30 years of service had the sky fallen so quiet. In the spring of the year of the fire rat, the stars dimmed. At first, the court believed it a passing phenomenon, a mist perhaps, or seasonal haze. But weeks passed, then months. The sky remained shrouded in ashen veils. The sun barely cast shadows, and at night, the constellations dissolved into a blank dome of grey. Shunbao recorded the first anomaly on the 24th day of the second month. No stars. The plough has vanished. No moon visible, though calendar confirms its fullness. The firmament has gone to sleep. He submitted his scroll to the Court of Astronomy, where his superiors marked it with a red ink character for Zai, calamity. Within, the forbidden chambers, the Emperor Wu of Liang sat upon the phoenix throne in growing unease. Though he was a poet and a patron of the Dharma, he knew well the consequence of a silent sky. In China, The mandate of heaven was no mere metaphor. It was the divine contract between ruler and realm. If the heavens no longer approved, famine, rebellion, and dissolution would follow. So he summoned Xun Bao. The astronomer entered the court barefoot, as was the tradition, his robes of black and indigo trailing behind him like night itself. He bowed thrice. "My eyes see only veils, your majesty," he said. "The stars have hidden their judgment. The sun stares but does not speak." The emperor replied, "What crime have we committed that heaven turns its face?" Xun Bao had no answer. Outside the palace, the land whispered of imbalance. The rice paddies near the Yangtze yielded sickly stalks. The lotus flowers bloomed too early, then died in the night. Cicadas did not sing. Peasants wrote verses of sorrow upon paper boats and floated them downriver, praying they might reach the ears of forgotten gods. Inside the observatory, Xun Bao and his apprentices scoured ancient records. They compared bamboo slips and silk maps from the Zhou and Qin dynasties. There were tales of dim suns, yes, but nothing so sustained. One fragment from the Han read, "In the year when the hawk flew blind, the sun hung pale, and frost kissed the peach in spring." They marked that scroll with incense ash and sealed it in the archive of omens. The court began rituals of correction. Dragons carved of sandalwood were paraded through the capital. Bells were rung through the night market. Buddhist and Taoist monks fasted beneath banners stitched with starlight and scripture. The emperor himself made a pilgrimage to the southern shrine of Nanyu, offering silk and poetry to the mountain spirits. Still, the sky did not answer. Xun Bao took to the observatory's upper platform alone. He stopped writing reports. Instead, he began carving small wooden stars by hand. Each was inscribed with a single virtue: Ren, compassion; Yi, righteousness; Ji, wisdom. He placed them one by one along the edge of the parapet, an offering of memory in lieu of visibility. One night, he lit a lantern and hung it upon a kite made of rice paper and lacquered bamboo. He launched it into the air, watching it vanish into the grey, hoping, perhaps foolishly, that if the sky would not speak, it might still listen. The emperor heard of the gesture and called him back to court. "You placed a star in the sky, they say." "A symbol, Majesty," Xun Bao replied. "If heaven will not guide us, then we must guide each other." The emperor wept. Not long after, a young girl from the southern provinces arrived at court, bringing with her a folded paper marked with a child's brushstroke, a depiction of the sun, drawn in brilliant red with gold flecks, and a single sentence: "I saw it once. I remember." The court archivists placed the drawing beside the imperial seal, and from that day forward, the emperor ordered that all children be taught the shape of stars and sun, even if they could not see them. Memory, he declared, is now a form of worship. And so, the palace scribes and astronomers began compiling a new document, Tianji, the Book of Hidden Heaven. Not to forecast eclipses or portents, but to remember the sky in its fullness. It became a collection of illustrations, myths, poems, and star charts rendered from recollection and longing. In the final month of that year, Xun Bao carved one last wooden star. He etched no character into it. Instead, he left it blank, an offering to whatever light might one day return. Then, on the first morning of the new year, the clouds shifted. Not fully, not brightly, but enough. A narrow beam of amber light pierced the veil, striking the jade tiles of the western pavilion. The emperor walked barefoot to the terrace, where he stood in silence. When Xun Bao was summoned again, he brought with him the blank star. He placed it into the emperor's hands and said simply, "Now it has a name, Hope." So concludes our passage through the celestial court, where memory became prophecy and silence a teacher. Next, we sail southward to the lush lands of the Horn of Africa, where the kingdom of Aksum stands watchful under a sky that no longer favors even the faithful. In the stone-veined heart of the Ethiopian highlands, where terraced fields once bloomed like green stairways into the heavens, there stood the kingdom of Aksum, a place proud, ancient, and devout. Its roots ran deep into scripture and into the dust. And for centuries, its people had known the rhythms of the sky as intimately as a shepherd knows his flock. The whispering clouds of Belg, the fierce generosity of Kiremt, and the blessed stillness of Bega. But in the year 536, those rhythms ceased. No thunder rolled. No rains fell. The winds shifted, then grew silent. The sky dimmed, as if mourning something it could no longer name. In a small stone church, built beneath the shadow of a crumbling obelisk, a priest named Tesfaye lit a taper at dawn and prayed for the return of the clouds. He was not a man of miracles. He did not claim visions or hear the voices of angels. But he knew the scripture by heart, and he knew the soil beneath his feet. And when both turned silent, he did what any man of faith must do. He remembered. He wrote in neat Ge'ez script upon a scroll yellowing with age. The fig tree offers no sweetness, the goats are lean, and the wells echo. Still, we lift our hands to the sky. Still, we wait. Outside, in the hills and valleys beyond Aksum, the land withered. The barley failed. The teff curled in on itself. Flocks wandered further, only to return thinner and quieter. And the people came, barefoot, dust-covered, hollow-eyed, asking the same question Tesfaye asked himself each morning. Has heaven forgotten? He told them no, but in truth, he did not know. The king of Aksum, whose line claimed descent from Solomon and Sheba, led processions through the capital, his royal robes traded for sackcloth. The Ark of the Covenant, sacred to Aksumite Christianity, was carried beneath heavy linen, surrounded by priests chanting the Ketera. Incense filled the streets, but the sky remained mute. Tesfaye stood among the faithful, watching the people more than the heavens. He saw an old woman pour her last jar of honey upon the church steps. He saw children, too weak to walk, press their palms to the altar's stone. He saw hope, thin as thread, refusing to snap. So he began to write a new book, not of saints or kings, but of endurance. He called it the Book of Waiting. In it, he recorded moments too small for chronicles, too sacred for forgetting. Day 38. A child asked if the rain was a type of bird. I said yes. Day 52. A man wept because his ox died, then helped his neighbor plant anyway. Day 67. No green, but a song rose from the fields. I followed the voice. It was a girl singing, a lullaby to the dirt. The church walls grew dark with soot from candles that burned both night and day. No one asked for sermons. They asked only for presence. Tesfaye walked among them, blessing dry seeds, touching blistered hands, whispering psalms meant to bring rain, though his own voice cracked from thirst. Still, the drought deepened. 1. Dawn, he travelled to a hermitage carved into the cliffside, where an anchorite monk had not spoken in 20 years. Tesfaye offered bread, received silence, and then asked only, "How do you endure a sky that does not answer?" The monk pointed to a withered fig tree and, for the first time in 2 decades, said, "Even now it remembers how to fruit." Tesfaye returned to his village and planted a fig beside the chapel door. From that day forward, he asked each family to bring 1 stone to place in the church courtyard, not for building, but for remembering. They piled them slowly, one by one, until a low mound rose in the center of the square. At its peak, Tesfaye carved in Amharic, "We remember the rain," and then, as if memory itself stirred something long dormant, the sky shifted. It began with scent, not of water, but of potential. The air thickened, the dust settled. Birds, only 2 at first, returned to the acacia trees and sang a note, too brief to be certain. Then, on the 89th day of Tesfaye's chronicle, a wind rose from the east, carrying with it a tremor in the leaves. That evening, the rain came, not in torrents, not even in full, but in light, scattered drops, like tears, like mercy. They struck the stones, the fig tree, the roof of the church. Tesfaye stepped barefoot into the yard and held out his hands. The drops kissed his palms and slid down his arms. The people emerged, quietly. Some wept, some laughed, others simply stood with closed eyes, as if listening to an old friend speak. After a long silence, Tesfaye returned to his scroll and wrote, "Rain is not the sky's gift. It is the earth's memory, rising." And so, in the ancient highlands of Axum, where saints sleep in stone and history is etched into mountain and script alike, the people endured, not because of prophecy, but because they remembered. They did not summon the rain. They waited for it faithfully. Now let us turn our eyes to the north, where in the frozen valleys of the Altai, herders read the heavens like scripture, and now face a sky that gives no sign. In the vast stillness of the Altai Mountains, where Mongolia, Siberia, Kazakhstan, and China breathe into each other across snow and wind, the sky was once a trusted map. For centuries, the clans of the steppe read its script in stars, clouds, and flight. They did not build stone cities or carve laws into pillars, for they carried their knowledge on horseback and in the folds of song. They knew when to move the herds by the arc of the Pleiades, when to bury the dead by the path of the wind. And then, in the year 536, the sky went blank. Batu was an old man then, though the years had not bent his back nor dimmed his gaze. He was the last Tengerian Zurach of his people, a skydrawer, one who could mark the heavens and find in them the story of the world. Every winter he taught the young ones how to trace constellations onto sheepskin, to sing the names of the 7 northern stars, to call upon the spirits of cloud and flame. But in that year, there were no stars to draw. The nights became thick with grey silence. The cold arrived too early and did not lift. The horses shivered beneath layers of wool. The sheep wandered, confused, and the herders could no longer tell east from west when the sun refused to rise. Batu stood outside his felt ger and watched the sky with eyes that no longer knew what to expect. "It has been swallowed," he told his daughter Altana. "By what?" "By something too quiet to name." The herds began to fail. The winter came without warning and stayed beyond reason. Snow buried the pastures before the autumn grass could dry. Foals were stillborn. Milk turned thin. The river froze in a week. The clan began to argue. Some blamed the mountain spirits, others unseen invaders. A few whispered that the sky itself had been stolen by a jealous god. Batu listened, but did not speak. Instead, he began carving a new set of stars, not in sheepskin, but in bone. He took the ribs of an ox that had frozen in the night and etched onto each the patterns of constellations he remembered, not as they were, but as they had once been told to him, in the breath of his grandfather's voice. He laid them out in a circle near the fire and said to the children, "These are the stars beneath the snow. Let them guide your dreams, if not your herds." One night, the wind rose sharp and strange. A young herder named Tömer returned to camp with frostbite and a tale of a tree struck down in the middle of a frozen lake, blackened though no lightning had been seen. Batu went there the next morning. He stood before the fallen tree and knelt. In the ash, he saw a footprint, not of man nor beast, but shaped like an open eye. He returned home and opened the fireskin pouch his mother had left him long ago. Inside were 4 dried petals from a flower that had once only bloomed during the northern solstice. He burned them. That night, he dreamed of a sky with no moon and a voice that said, "When you can no longer read the sky, you must become it." Next day, he gathered the clan. He did not offer certainty. He offered memory. He sang the old songs. He drew constellations in the snow with his staff. He recited the journeys of ancestors who had crossed ice with nothing but belief in the stars to come. Then he instructed the people to move, not toward known pastures, but toward warmth wherever it might lie. They packed their jers and sleds, their talismans and bones. They turned away from the valley that had betrayed them and rode westward into deeper cold. On the third day, they passed a herd of frozen yaks, eyes still open, bodies half buried in drift. On the fifth, they saw a skyhound, one of the large northern wolves, walking alone, not hunting, just walking. On the seventh day, a child pointed upward and said, "I see a star." It was not true, but Batu said, "Yes, I see it too." That night, he gave the child one of his carved ribs, the one with Orion on it, and said, "Now the sky remembers you." They continued west until they reached the tree line, where pines bent low under frost and a hot spring steamed quietly beneath stone. It was not paradise, but it was enough. They made camp, set fires, and that evening, the clouds thinned just slightly, enough for a single dot of light to flicker. It was not Polaris, but it was something. Batu stood beneath it, tears freezing on his cheeks. He whispered to the sky, "You are slow to return, but so are we, and yet we return." And so, in the blank sky above the Altai, where the stars once sang and the snow now swallowed sound, a people moved not by map, but by memory. They remembered the stars, even when the stars forgot them. Now, let us travel southward, beyond the Indus and the desert, to the cities of the Gupta collapse, where scholars pack scrolls beneath fading murals, and the minds that once charted logic must now find solace in silence. In the heartland of a kingdom fading into memory, where the last embers of the Gupta Empire still glowed faintly within sun-warmed bricks and domed sanctuaries, there stood a library once whispered of across the subcontinent. It was not the largest, nor the most ornate, but it was a sanctuary of ink, of breath, of syllables shaped like stars. Its walls bore frescoes of gods who danced upon atoms and scholars who tamed numbers with verses. It had stood through war, plague, and drought. But, in the year 536, even it fell quiet. Aryananda had studied within its halls for more than 20 years. He was neither monk nor noble. He wore the ochre of learning, the thread of silence, and kept a silver stylus close at hand. His life was measured in scrolls copied and commentaries footnoted, and for the first time, he could not write. It began with the lamps. They burned strangely, flickering not with the rhythm of wind or oil, but as though they feared the dark surrounding them. The flames curved sideways. Smoke hung too low. Then came the sky, dull, pale, seemingly drained of intent. The sun no longer fell into the courtyards as it had. The frescoes grew dim. The painted depictions of Surya and Chandra, the solar and lunar gods, seemed to retreat deeper into plaster. Aryananda recorded the change in his journal, which he now shared only with himself. The sky no longer teaches. Shadows arrive at dawn. No birds greet the manuscripts. Outside the library, the city changed. Once a centre for learning, a crossroads of scroll and saddlebag, it now lay heavy under silence. Students began to leave. Rice shipments stopped. A philosopher once known for debating 8 disciples at once now stood alone in the corridor, speaking only to the wind. In the temples, the bells rang softer. In the homes, fires were lit, not for ritual, but survival. Aryananda continued to sit at his low writing table each morning, but now he wrote not sutras or proofs, but fragments. What is logic when time does not follow light? What is prayer when the sun forgets its vow? What remains when even clarity dims? He was not alone in his unrest. The head librarian, an elder named Pravahana, began sealing books in clay urns, muttering that knowledge must be buried before it was lost. Another scholar, once devoted to astronomy, abandoned her star maps and began painting mandalas blindfolded, saying, The patterns now come from within. One evening, a young student named Samita approached Aryananda and asked, "Does the universe punish wisdom?" He could not answer. Instead, he took her hand and led her to the Hall of Measures, a chamber lined with murals that charted the rise and fall of light according to ancient Sanskrit calculations. There, he lit a single lamp and read aloud the first line carved above the entrance. "To seek is to serve. To serve is to remember." They sat in silence beneath that inscription for a long while. The next morning, Aryananda began a new scroll, not of mathematics or cosmology, but of memories. He wrote of how the mango trees once leaned toward the sun, of how the birds nested in the alcoves of the library roof, of how, on clear nights, the constellations above matched those painted on the ceiling of the east wing. The scroll became a map, not of knowledge, but of experience. Other scholars, seeing him, began their own works. One painted each god of learning in shades of ash. Another bound dry leaves between sheets of bamboo and called it the texture of hunger. Samita began composing hymns to the absent sky, set to rhythms only she could hear. And then, on the 51st day of the dark season, something stirred. Not light, but breeze. It curled into the halls of the library, lifting the edge of an open scroll, fluttering the robes of the meditating scribe. It carried with it the scent of the distant forest, dry bark, old soil, a memory of rain not yet fallen. Aryananda stepped into the courtyard and looked upward. No sun, but there was movement. He whispered, "The silence shifts." He gathered the scholars, not to teach, but to listen. In the center of the painted library, they sat in a circle and chanted the syllable Om, not in unison, but each at their own breath, creating a sound like wind in hollow stone. It was not loud, it was not triumphant, but it was shared. That night, Aryananda wrote a final entry for the season. "We do not wait for the sky to return. We teach ourselves how to shine." Light is not only in the heavens, it is in the habit of remembering. So, in the twilight of an empire and the hush of sunless days, the library lived. Not by flame, but by those who refused to let memory fade. They could not summon the sky, but they could preserve what it once gave. Now, we turn westward again, toward the moors and marshes of early medieval England, where the hearths of common folk flicker, and folklore begins to shape the meaning of a world gone dim. In the fenlands of Britannia, where reeds murmured and owls called over black waters, the people did not speak of empires. They spoke of weather, of beasts, of the sounds that drifted from the bogs at night. They were not mapmakers or monks. They were fishers, weavers, beekeepers, and they measured time not in calendars, but in harvests, storms, and the turning of lambs in the womb. So when the sun began to vanish, they called it not by name, but by story. "It's the year the sun was stolen," one child whispered. And though no one could say by whom, all agreed it had not gone willingly. Iadgifu, a widow and weaver, lived at the edge of one such village, a cluster of wattle and daub huts huddled around a stream that had begun to slow. Her husband had been a thatcher, her son a swineherd. Both were gone now, lost to a fever that had come during the frost of the previous year. Since then, Edgifu lived quietly, spinning wool beside her hearth. But in the year 536, the wool grew damp in her hands. The air never dried. The fire smoked, but did not warm. And the sky, grey and bruised, never lifted its veil. The villagers noticed the changes first in their breath. It misted in summer, then in the hens, who stopped laying, then in the sheep, whose lambs were born small, if they were born at all. At first, they blamed witches. Then, perhaps sensing that even witches could not hold the sun hostage, they stopped blaming altogether and simply waited. But waiting has its own dangers. In the quiet, fear grows. Edgifu, who had never spoken more than needed, found herself gathering the children at dusk. She would set them around the hearth, feed them oatcakes softened with broth, and speak, not of famine, but of stories. Stories she'd learned from her grandmother. Stories she'd whispered to her son when the wind scratched at the shutters. Stories of when the sun once hid for a year and was coaxed back with song. Of a bird who flew to the end of the world to fetch fire. Of a clever girl who lit a candle with her own heartbeat. The children listened, wide-eyed, their hands cupped around bowls as if cradling warmth itself. What happened to the girl? One child would ask. She became the flame, Edgifu would say, and the world followed her home. In time, even the adults began to linger near the door. They did not ask for logic. They asked for light, and so Edgifu began weaving not just wool, but memory. She stitched sunbursts into cloaks. She spun golden threads into belts. She tied dyed ribbon around bundles of herbs and hung them in the cottages as if they were charms. One man scoffed, "What good is thread when there's no grain?" Edgifu looked at him and said, "Thread binds more than cloth." Then, in the deepest part of the dimming, when the fog sat low for 10 days without lifting, a girl named Leofa disappeared. They searched the fen, calling her name. They lit pitch torches, watched the reeds bend, found only her shoes beside the stream. Despair crept into the village like frost into root. That night, no stories were told, but Edgifu could not sleep. She went to her hearth, placed a single candle in the window, and whispered a story, not aloud, but within. She imagined Leofa walking through the marsh, guided not by flame, but by tale. She imagined the bird who fetched fire carrying it in its beak, swooping low to show the way. She whispered, "Let story be the path." The next morning, just before dawn, Leofa returned. Cold, muddied, but alive. "I followed the stars," she said, "but there were none." "What then?" Edgifu asked. Leofa hesitated, then answered. A voice. It said, "Remember the bird." No one spoke. They simply looked at Edgifu. After that, stories became prayers. The villagers carved suns into fence posts. They sang lullabies that had not been heard since the old winter wars. Edgifu taught the children to weave tiny circles from straw, symbols of light hung over doors not to repel evil, but to welcome return. And one evening, as the fire crackled, lo, she told a new story. Of a village that held its breath for a year. Of a people who forgot how to count days, but remembered how to dream. Of a flame that stayed lit, not because of fuel, but because it was shared. They wrote none of it down, but all of it was remembered. One morning, late in the year, a glimmer came. Not a sunrise, but a lightness in the mist. A kind of quiet that felt less like warning and more like promise. And on that day, Edgifu opened her shutters wide and left them so. She placed a bundle of dried flowers on the sill, wrapped in golden thread. "For the sun," she said, "so it remembers how to come home." And so, in a corner of the world where stories travelled faster than horses, and fire was never taken for granted, light was kept, not by torch, but by tongue. They did not defeat the darkness. They outlasted it, word by word, flame by flame. Next, we turn once more to the Mediterranean coast, where in a monastery carved from sandstone cliffs, hermits and healers seek divine rhythm in a world gone still. In the silent reaches of the Egyptian desert, beyond the reach of Nile and city, among dunes shaped like sleeping lions, there were caves where men went to forget the world and be remembered by God. They were called Abbas, the Desert Fathers, and they had long lived beneath a sky that did not promise, only watched. Their monasteries were carved from sandstone and scrubbed clean by wind. Their days were marked not by clock or candle, but by psalms, breath, and the shifting of shadow across bare rock. By 536, one such man, Abba Theonis, had not spoken in 7 years. He had taken a vow not out of pride, but out of devotion. His words were now his prayers, and his prayers were sung only with breath. Each day he would walk barefoot across the sand to a small ledge that overlooked the desert plain, where he would stand still for hours, as if listening for something older than time. When the sky began to dim, Theonas did not flinch. Others, however, did. The young monks from nearby skeets came running with questions and scrolls. They carried with them fear from Alexandria, of failed crops, of cold air from Maul, the north of sunless days and saltless sea. They asked, "Has the Lord turned his face?" Theonas gave no reply. He only turned toward the east and touched the corner of his robe to his lips, then to the rock at his feet, a gesture of memory. The monks returned often, sometimes bringing pilgrims, women and men from the cities who had lost families, wealth, understanding. They came barefoot and broken, stumbling over stones, seeking healing from a man who offered none. Still, Theonas received them. He offered dates, a sip of water, and silence. He let them sit beside him on the ledge, if they could bear the stillness. Some wept, others raged, but all, eventually, fell quiet. And in that quiet, something changed. They began to listen, not for miracles, but for the sound beneath sound, the breeze through dry reeds, the shifting of dust, the whisper of linen against skin. Some said they heard God. Others said they heard themselves for the first time. Theonas did not correct either view. At night, he returned to his cell, a hollowed room lit only by memory, and copied scripture not with ink, but with chalk on stone. He rewrote the Psalms by heart, line by line, until his hands bled. Then he washed them in sand and began again. "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow, the shadow, the shadow." He carved that single verse 7 times along the edge of his wall. Outside, the wind carried the scent of nothing. Not rain, not harvest, just stillness. In E. The 3rd month of dimming, the monastery bell cracked from cold. "A sign," said one monk, "that heaven had shut its ears." Another claimed the bell had rung too long without being heard. But Theonas did not look to bells, he looked to feet. Each footprint in the sand, to him, was a psalm. Each step towards stillness, a hymn. Each moment spent without demand, an offering. He began drawing circles in the sand around his cave, 12 each day, one for each disciple, though not named aloud. He walked them slowly, chanting not in words, but in hums, low and steady, as if echoing a heart that beat not for himself. Then came the child. She was no older than 10, wrapped in tattered wool, hair crusted with salt from distant tears. She had wandered from a caravan lost near the coast, a merchant's daughter, or perhaps a shepherd's orphan. No one knew. Theonas found her asleep at the edge of his prayer circle, one hand resting on a stone he had carved into a psalm. He brought her water, dates, let her sleep. When she awoke, she said, "You're very quiet." He nodded. She stayed. She did not speak much either, only hummed when he hummed, traced his steps in the sand, tried to copy his chalkwork on her own stone slab, etching crooked letters with a bone shard. After 7 days, she pointed at the dawnless sky and whispered, "Will it ever come back?" Theonas picked up a handful of sand and let it pour through his fingers. Then, for the first time in years, he whispered, "The light is not lost. It is remembering its way through the dust." She smiled, and from that moment, she called him Papa Ash and followed him through his psalms. Soon, others returned. Pilgrims, scribes, a bishop. They heard that the desert held a man who had spoken one sentence and calmed the wind. A man who did not explain the silence, but walked it with grace. They began to call the place not a monastery, but a lamp. They brought food, stories, scrolls, and sometimes just silence to offer in return. Theonas never spoke again after that day, but in the final weeks of the year, the clouds parted briefly. A thin beam of light touched the edge of the cave's entrance. Theona stepped into it. He did not raise his hands. He did not weep. He only stood, unmoving, letting it trace the wrinkles of his brow. And the child, now holding his hand, whispered, "Amen." So ends our chapter in the desert, where silence became sanctuary, and shadow did not mean the absence of faith, but its deepening. Now we return toward Europe once more, to the Rhineland valleys, where vineyards have withered and a dying bishop writes one final sermon in a church of empty pews. The valley had once been green. Vines crept like hopeful scripture across the hillsides, and bells rang from every steeple, slow, deep, and sweet, calling vineyard hands from work to prayer and children from wandering to stillness. But in the year 536, the bells rang less, and when they did, they were not sweet. Bishop Adelhard stood at the threshold of St. Corbinian's church, overlooking a vineyard that no longer grew. Where once the clusters of Riesling grapes hung heavy in late summer, there now remained only brittle branches and frost-burned leaves. The wind tasted of ash, and the sky remained a sheet of unbroken grey. Inside, the church was colder still. The pews had grown emptier each Sunday. Some families fled south, seeking sunlit harvests. Others stayed, but no longer sang. A few simply vanished, perhaps into the woods, or into silence. Adelhard lit candles at each mass, even when only 3 souls came to kneel. He still lifted, the host with trembling hands, though the bread was coarse and bitter, made from flour blended with ground acorns. Each morning he read the Psalms by the narrow window of the sacristy. "How long, O Lord? Will you forget me forever? How long will you hide your face from me?" He did not ask for an answer, only the strength to read the next line. In his youth, Adelhard had been a scholar, trained in the scriptoria of Trier, fond of debate and the poetry of Augustine. But now his sermons had grown shorter, simpler. They were no longer written to convince, but to comfort. And still, fewer came. He began carving a homily into the old wooden pulpit, line by line, using a dull blade once meant for candles. God is not the light. He is the voice that speaks when light fails. On the 3rd Sunday of Advent, only one boy appeared at the chapel, barefoot, wild-haired, no older than 10. He sat in the front pew and stared with sharp blue eyes. Adelhard gave the homily anyway. He spoke of Job, not in despair, but in waiting. He spoke of how the Psalms were written in darkness before they were sung in light. He told the boy that hope was not warmth. Hope was the will to kneel in the cold. After the blessing, the boy came forward and asked, "Why do you still speak if no one listens?" Adelhard knelt before him and replied, "Because God is still listening, even when he is silent." The boy nodded and came back the next week. Word spread slowly, as such things do in the cold, that the bishop still preached, that the chapel still stood, that the candle above the altar had not gone out. People began to return, not many, but enough. They brought what they had: chestnuts, wool scraps, broken flutes, old hymns. One old woman carried in a stained tapestry from her cellar and hung it behind the altar. It bore the faded image of the Last Supper, but the faces had all blurred into one another, like a single figure watching from 12 angles. Adelhard resumed writing, not sermons but letters, addressed to no one in particular, to the next priest or wanderer or singer. The stones are still holy. The wine did not ferment this year, but the word remained. I could no longer feel the presence, but I chose not to leave. He tucked each letter into the crevices of the church walls, beneath pews, inside candlesticks, behind icons. He called it his liturgy of leaving. Then came the news. The Bishop of Metz had died. The Abbey of Disibodenberg had collapsed in snow. The roads to Mainz were frozen and impassable. Adelhard took a single candle into the crypt and sat beside the bones of those buried before him. He whispered every name he could recall. Some had no graves, some had no stories, but he named them just the same. Erna, who wove lace for the altar, Matthias, who once sang even when drunk, little Sophie, who danced in the nave when she thought no one was watching. He returned to the sanctuary. He unlocked the sacristy and brought out the white vestments worn only at Easter. He dusted them clean and donned them for the final Mass of the year. Only 8 people came. He did not stand on the pulpit. He stood at the center of the aisle, among them, and read from memory. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. And then he whispered a final line, not from scripture, but from himself. If the sun forgets, let us remind it. The people said, Amen. And in that moment, a single shaft of light broke through the chapel's narrow window and struck the old stone floor. Not warm, not gold, but real. The boy was the first to see it. He stood, walked over, and placed the bishop's candle into the beam, and so it burned. So ends the last sermon in the valley, where light had not vanished, only waited for someone to speak its name again. Now we ascend into the heights of the Carpathians, where a reclusive herbalist seeks cures in frozen root and bone while the air thins and the world forgets colour. Up in the Carpathians, where the mountains touch cloud and the trees lean close to listen, the winter of 536 arrived not as a sudden guest, but as a long, unwelcome tenant. It settled quietly in the bones of the forest, painting everything with frost and muting even the birdsong. Snow fell in long sheets, and the sky above, dull, unchanging, sorrowful, pressed down on the highlands like a weary sigh. Mirella lived alone on the mountainside. A herbalist by trade, a solitary soul by nature, she had always kept to herself. Her cottage sat on the edge of the tree line, wrapped in ivy and smoke, with rows of drying herbs that swayed gently in the breeze, until the breeze grew still, and the herbs began to blacken one by one. She knew the plants better than she knew people. Yarrow, wormwood, valerian, juniper, each had its song, its secret, its proper silence. Her hands, cracked but steady, had once soothed fevers, drawn poison from wounds, eased pain for those too old to be helped otherwise. But now, her knowledge seemed to shrink with the light. Roots no longer pulled clean from the soil. Leaves crumbled into ash between her fingers. Even the spring near her home, a trickling, eternal companion, froze without warning, as if caught mid-sentence. Still, she refused to leave. She lit her fire each morning and set her kettle to boil, even if there was nothing to steep. She wrote daily in a journal of pressed birch bark. Day 42. No sun. The elderberries have died. Found a patch of lichen. Bitter. Ground it into paste. No taste. But something of earth remains. The villagers came sporadically, moving through the fog, like shadows. They brought empty baskets and silent eyes. Some asked for tonics. Others only sat by her hearth, letting the warmth reach their skin before turning back into the mist. A mother came with a baby who would not wake. A boy came with frostbite down, to the bone. A priest came with no voice left to pray. To each Mirella gave what she could, crumbs of comfort in a world devoured by cold, but she knew it would not be enough. One night, after the wind screamed through the chimney like a soul in mourning, she opened her mother's book, a collection of inked fragments, spells, recipes, and dreams. Tucked between brittle pages was an old note written in a trembling hand. Zapada radachina, the snow root, said to bloom only beneath the body of death, said to heal what nothing else dares. It was legend, nothing more. But what was medicine, if not belief made tangible? And so, Mirella set out. She left her cottage at dawn, though the sky gave no sign of it, and climbed toward the highest ridge. The air was thinner there, and the wind harsher, but she walked with purpose, guided by instinct, by memory, and by a song her grandmother once hummed while stirring elderflower wine. Snow above, life below. Find the place where silence grows. On the second day, she found a grove of trees bent inward like cupped hands. On the third, she came upon the carcass of a deer, frozen mid-step, its eyes clear as glass. She knelt. Beside it, pressed her palm to the snow and felt nothing. Then, on the fourth day, she reached a clearing where no tracks marked the snow, and the world seemed paused between breaths. There, beneath the curled form of a wolf, frozen in sleep or surrender, she saw a thin sliver of white. She dug carefully, reverently, until her fingers brushed something cold and fibrous. The snow root, pale, veined, twisting like memory through earth long undisturbed. She did not cry. She only whispered, "You remembered," and wrapped the root in linen. The journey back was harder. Her legs ached. Her breath caught. Once, she nearly fell into a crevice masked by drift, but the root pulsed faintly in her hand like a heartbeat. And so she walked on. At home, she boiled water from melted snow, set her mortar to stone, and crushed the root with trembling care. The scent that rose was sharp, like pine, blood, and thunder. She mixed 12 doses, sealed each in a glass vial bound with ash twine. The next morning, she lit her hearth and opened her door. They came, wordless, as always. She gave the vials without cost, without promise, only with a nod and the instruction. Take with warmth, not just in the body, in the spirit. One old man drank and said he dreamt of his wife's laughter. A young girl claimed she could hear the trees humming again. Even Mirella, who had not dreamt in months, found herself waking with a tear on her cheek and the scent of warm rain in her nose. She knew the root had not saved the world, but it had saved the memory of healing, and in that, it had done more than most. So in the chill of a forgotten range, among root and stone and sorrow, one woman found the thing beneath the frost, not miracle, but meaning, not cure, but care. And in that quiet, something ancient stirred. Now, one final ember remains. Let us return at last to the heart of it all, to the ashes of empire, where a child lights a candle in a ruin and refuses to let it die. The city had been gone for a long time, its arches crumbled into moss-covered memory, its baths filled with roots and silence. Its columns, once white as bone, now leaned like tired elders whispering secrets to the earth. It had once been a Roman villa, grand, opulent, humming with the echoes of empire. But in the year 536, it was only a shell, and within that shell lived a girl named Lucilla. She had never known the empire, only its stories. Her grandmother, before her voice gave out, had described golden mosaics and marble floors, had sung songs of feasts, of fountains, of laughter echoing through courtyards. Now, the courtyard was broken. Weeds grew through cracks in the tiles. Birds nested in the mouths of fallen statues. And Lucilla lived in what had once been a storeroom, with a candle, a blanket, and a bell that no longer rang. She was small, 8, perhaps 9, thin, like all children of the dim years. Her hair hung in tangled ropes down her back, and her hands were always smudged with soot. But her eyes were steady. Each night, she lit the candle. Not for warmth, not for reading, but because her grandmother had said, "As long as there is flame, we are not finished," so she guarded it. When the wind howled through broken windows, she shielded it with her body. When others came, tired villagers from nearby, wandering traders, quiet priests, she let them sit by it. No one spoke much, but everyone watched the flame. They began to leave offerings, a twist of dried mint, a small clay coin, a torn page from a book too damaged to bind. Lucilla never asked why. She only whispered, "The candle sees." In time, people called the place Domus Lucis, the House of Light. It was not a church. It was not a refuge. It was something quieter. Oh, remembering. One old man, bent nearly double, came each week to sit by the fire and hum lullabies. A mother came with her son and showed him how to warm his fingers without burning. A hunter left an arrowhead beside the flame and said, "So I never forget what I aim for." Lucilla listened to all of them, but she never left the villa, not even when the snow swallowed the hills, not even when the river overflowed, not even when no one came for 7 days. She stayed. She tended the flame, and in the flickering light, she told herself the stories her grandmother had once told. The sun is sleeping beneath the sea. One day it will wake. Until then, we are its dream. On the darkest night of that year, a traveler came, a woman wrapped in linen, face scarred, eyes older than the sky. She carried nothing but a wooden staff and a string of beads. She knelt. Beside the candle, Lucilla offered her broth. The woman declined. She only asked, "Why do you keep it lit?" Lucilla shrugged. "Because someone must." The woman nodded. "Then let me sit with you. I have no story, only silence." Lucilla replied, "Silence is what candles speak best in." And so they sat. That night, the flame danced high, higher than usual. Some said it was the draught. Others said it was the wind's way of bowing. But Lucilla believed the candle had grown because someone new had believed in it. The next morning, she awoke to find a circle of pebbles around the flame, small, smooth, each marked with a scratch, letters from languages she didn't know. She kept them. Days passed, then weeks. The light began to change, not brighter, but clearer. The sky, once a smothered grey, showed hints of hue, not blue, not yet, but suggestion. And then, one evening, Lucilla stood outside the villa and saw a shadow move that wasn't her own. It was sunlight, weak, hesitant, but real. She ran inside and lit the candle anyway, because light, once kept, deserved to be celebrated. Word spread again. More people came. A small group of children brought sticks of wax and asked how to make candles. Lucilla taught them. Soon, the ruin was not a ruin. It was a home of small flames. Every room glowed with a quiet, patient light. No sermons, no songs. Just the sound of fire breathing softly in the hush. Lucilla, now a keeper not of one candle but of many, wrote on a stone with soot. We do not light the flame to end the dark. We light it so we remember who we were before it. And in time, when the sun did rise again, not like before, but slowly, in golden crumbs, she was there to see it. She did not cheer. She did not cry. She simply lit the candle, as she always had. Because even the sun, when it returned, needed to know it had been missed. So ends the final part of our journey. Across frost and famine, smoke and song, we followed those who endured, not because they were strong, but because they refused to let memory die. One flame kept alive through darkness can be enough to light the whole world again.